Welcome to the SACNAS Native Initiatives webinar featuring Dr. Ruth Sweetgrass She-Kills and Jennifer Harrington, who will be discussing and sharing more insights to their article, Creating More Inclusive Spaces in STEM for Native Americans, featured in the SACNAS STEM and Culture Chronicle. My name is Dr. Daryl Monto. I am the SACNAS Native Initiatives Manager. I am an enrolled member of the Kiowa Tribe of Oklahoma and also of Apache and Comanche descent. We are very glad that you joined us today, and I am looking forward to the Q&A session from today's webinar along with the chat. I believe that we will have a lively discussion, and also both will be full of information to share. So before we get started, I want to take a few moments to share information with some of our first-time attendees. So if you can bear with me for one moment. SACNAS is a fully inclusive organization dedicated to achieving true diversity in STEM, where the field, including leadership positions, reflects the demographics of the population. As the nation's largest multicultural and multidisciplinary STEM diversity organization in the country, SACNAS creates space where all members, volunteers, and partners feel they belong and can embrace their intersectional identities. If you are not yet, we invite you to join SACNAS as a member. Membership gives you access to a welcome community of like-minded students and professionals from all STEM disciplines, including the opportunity to connect with one of our 118 chapters across the country. Eligibility to apply for programs specifically for each stage of your education or career, exclusive opportunities like jobs, internships, and more from our partners, and an opportunity to raise your voice for true diversity and inclusion in STEM. You can sign up for free by visiting sacnas.org/memberships. We have a few housekeeping rules to review as well. If you have questions throughout the panel portion of this webinar, we ask that you please hold on to till our presenters are done, our panelists are done, and you'll be able to submit your questions in the Q&A feature. We will answer as many questions as we can toward the end. Remember to always be polite and respectful to others with your comments. And if you have additional questions that we don't get to, please stay to the end of the webinar to see how you can continue the conversation in the SACNAS online community. Now let's get started. Today we are joined by Dr. Ruth Sweetgrass She-Kills and Jennifer Harrington. Jennifer Harrington is an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. She earned her Bachelor of Science degree in Resource Conservation and her Master of Science degree in Resource Conservation from the University of Montana. She is a Sloan Indigenous Graduate Fellow and has received funding awards from Indigenous Research and STEM Education, the Roberti Fellowship, and Hope Mountain. Currently, she is the Director of the Native American Natural Resource Program and a Social Science Researcher for the University of Montana's NSF-funded Willow Project. Our other panelist is Dr. Ruth Sweetgrass She-Kills. She is an enrolled citizen of the 3 affiliated tribes. She earned her associate's degree in environmental science from Nuada Hidatsa Sanish College, a bachelor's degree in elementary education from the University of North Dakota, a master's degree in organizational biology and ecology from the University of Montana, and her doctorate in forest and conservation sciences from the University of Montana. She is a Ford Foundation Fellow and Sloan Indigenous Graduate Fellow. Currently, she is the Director of the Native American Studies at Nuada Hidatsa Sanish College and co-PI for the University of Montana's NSF-funded Willow Project, where she leads the social science research team. So at this time, it is my honor to introduce our panelists, and I am going to have them take it away.
Thank you, Daryl. I am really happy to be here today. And as she mentioned, my name is Ruth Sweetgrass She-Kills, and I work I have appointments in 2 institutions, Nuada Hidatsa Sanish College, where I work in Native American Studies, and then also with the University of Montana as affiliate faculty. And hopefully you've been able to read our article that we have as part of the SACNAS Chronicle. For me, my entry into science, it was something that was always something I excelled in school. And growing up on the reservation, we did a lot of berry picking. We would do fishing, we would go hunting, we had gardens. So I grew up with this connection to the land and to the natural world. So going into school, a lot of things just made sense to me. The holistic worldview, the way we approached things, it really resonated with me, especially in my biology courses. So my mother wanted me to become a doctor, and I didn't like touching people, and I get squeamish about needles and things like that. So that wasn't a great route for me. The medical field wasn't a great route for me. And I did a semester at a different institution. I ended up transferring to my tribal college. And while I was there, I became, my tribal college, as I mentioned, is Nue'ta Heratza Sanish College. So that's located on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. And that's where I'm enrolled. So I'm both Mandan, Heratza, and then my mother's father is from Fort Peck Indian Reservation. So I also am Sioux and Assiniboine. So I transferred to my tribal college. And that's where I had my first real field experiences. I was hired as a research assistant, and I loved it. I loved that I was getting paid to work out in the field and getting taught how to ask research questions that were relevant to my community. Some of the research wasn't outdoor field based, so I did do some research with our diabetes program. I did research with mosquito surveillance, and it just, I loved it. It was such a great fit. So that experience, I think, really put me on this trajectory for my academic pursuits. And at a tribal college, the majority of the students are Native students. We did have some Native faculty, so I felt really comfortable. And that was part of why I transferred, was my classes at this non-tribal institution were huge classes, and I didn't have a single Native American professor. So coming back home, smaller class sizes, other Native students, Native faculty, doing research that was relevant to my interests, to my people. At that time, our college had just started their first bachelor's program, so that was in elementary education. I completed that degree and ended up working eventually as a natural resource education director for my tribal college, where we did research as well as capacity building projects. We did a lot of community education projects, and it was very fulfilling, and I learned a lot. We did a lot of collaborations with other institutions. Some of them were tribal colleges, some of them were non-tribal colleges, some of them were state, and some were federal agencies. So I really was able to work with a diverse array of science professionals, researchers, scholars, and in something that I loved, that was working in the field of natural resources. When I was working at the college, I had the opportunity to participate in a research experience for faculty in Costa Rica. And as a result of presenting the research at the end of that, I was recruited to my graduate studies at the University of Montana. So I went to another non-tribal institution, and that's where I experienced some of the same things that I had experienced in my first semester of college. I was one of very few Native scholars on campus. The university does have a relatively large Native population, but not too many of them are in STEM fields. And especially when you get into graduate level work. And in my field, there were not many, not many women. There's some women, but no Native faculty in any of my courses. So I completed my master's in organismal biology and ecology, and I worked on landscape genetics of black bears. So it was some field work, and it was a large project. So we did collaborate with multiple agencies, state and federal agencies on that project. And then I moved on to completed that degree, earned my master's, and started my PhD work, my doctoral work in the College of Forestry and Conservation. Based on my experiences as a student, as a researcher, as I had been a former faculty member, a staff member at a tribal college, one of the things that I noticed was some of the things that I mentioned. There weren't always a lot of other Native students. There weren't always courses that had Native instructors. And so that became the basis of my research for my dissertation. And I completed that. And then we submitted a proposal to move up to the next level. So I had worked with Native American students, but the next level was, all right, what's happening with our Native faculty? Why don't we have Native faculty? Why are there so few Native faculty? And so that's where we put together the proposal to NSF for looking at how can we better support our Native American faculty in the STEM fields. And that's the project that Jen and I work on now. And we have multiple components on that project. Part of it is mentorship. Part of it is working with the institutions and looking at their policies regarding diversity, for example. And let's see, then the social science component. So where we're collecting data and analyzing that. In our article, some of the things that we talk about as far as ways to make more inclusive environments include thinking about the identity. So making sure that we try to have spaces where Native faculty want to be because they're going to attract Native students, for example, and being open to having multiple ways of knowing, where we're open to having Indigenous research methodologies. So allowing our research as well as scholarship, as well as our coursework to be informed by Native perspectives, by Native pedagogy, by Native paradigms, values. And then, as I mentioned, a few of the other programs that have been supportive of my academic career, as well as continuing on. We mentioned the Ford Foundation. We mentioned, I don't think we mentioned things like SACNAS, things like ACEs, AHEC. There's all of these other programs, whether they're funding sources or whether they're organizations that build this sense of community. So you have this network of people who have gone through the trenches or going through the trenches. And that's one thing that I wanted to make sure and recognize is I know some of our colleagues are probably on the webinar. And so I think that's a key component for me to remember is I'm not alone. And there's other people that I can lean on to share their wisdom or to commiserate and to help strategize. But I'm going to stop with my experiences because I want to make sure that Jen also can share her experiences and then her insights on making more inclusive spaces. Thank you.
Bonjour. I'm Jen Harrington. I am humbled and very excited to be here with you today. Ruth has been an instrumental part of why I went on to get a master's degree here at the University of Montana, and it's it's largely because of one, she was here in the institution, and then she was a really instrumental mentor for me. This article that we wrote came about because we really have gained a passion to understand barriers, to more representation of Indigenous people in STEM, including students and faculty. But what can we do about it? What can we do to improve the situations on primarily white campuses or institutions and in tribal colleges? And my story, I shared about my coco, my grandma, and how important she has been. My grandma loved me, like I know it in my bones, and she, for as much as she went through in her life, she still had a very strong connection with the land. And though as a young person, I don't think I had a real passion for natural resources, I eventually found my way there after experiencing some trauma actually here on this campus. And after experiencing this trauma, I was a young person coming to school and I was raped. All sorts of things happened in which I kind of lost connection with my path in higher education and moving forward. Oh, I'm sorry. Am I not being loud? Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, if you can get closer to your mic.
Oh, okay, sorry. Anyway, so I guess I attempted to come here to the University of Montana and study music and English, and just didn't find connections. I came back and started in the forestry program, I believe, when I was in my late 20s, and found that I still wasn't connecting with not only which is the content. It didn't represent things that I understood in my relationship with the natural world. And so I would leave the institution. And when I did finally come back, maybe a little older and wiser because I'm a single parent and they've made me a little tougher. I was able to challenge at least approach some of the instructors about class content and kind of became aware of barriers through experience, I guess. And then as I started, discussing it with Ruth, as she was the director of the Native American Natural Resource Program,
I was having a little technical difficulty there. All right. Okay. Sorry, folks. So my computer was having some trouble there. We are ready to begin the Q&A portion of this webinar. So if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to drop your questions. You can drop them in the chat if you would like. And then we can get going there.
So one of the questions that I see in the chat is from my colleague Deanna. And Jen, the question says, can either of you speak to some of the differences in pedagogy for indigenized versus westernized science? And then somebody just cited another colleague of ours, Linda Black Elk, and has a link to an article that Linda wrote. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with Linda, she is an amazing ethnobotanist who works down at a tribal college in North Dakota, United Tribes Technical College. So I don't know if I've seen the particular article, but she's just an amazing scholar. So that's probably a great article. Did you want to share any comments about that first question, Jen?
Well, I guess the thing that I can give an example within my own experience of how I started to become aware of that, you know, and so I'm in forestry, and I was in a class that we were learning about how to take measurements within a forest, and the task was 40 students were boring trees to see how old they were, and this was an old growth ponderosa forest. And it really bothered me that we were doing this exercise in this small area, and it happens every year or every semester, and 40 kids and the same old growth trees. And so it was disturbing to me. So from my perspective, I mean, these are my relatives, you know, these are something we take care of. And I talked to the instructor about it, but he was very open about looking at how we're teaching stewardship and understanding a place. And in the Western science way, trees are objectified. In the way I look at that, my engagement with trees, that they are subjective, you know. And so I think that just our relationship with the place and how we learn, like in forestry management, is there's a different pedagogy involved, a more inclusive one.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things, not necessarily related to that, the difference between indigenized and westernized pedagogy, but I think that as a Native researcher, so whether it was as a graduate student or now as a faculty member, something that has been important to me is to be strategic about my collaborators, strategic about who I choose to work with, whether they're Native or non-Native. I think that our Willow team is one example. We have a number of Native scholars on that project, but we also have non-Native scholars on that project. And the thing about them is that they have experience working in Native communities. They have some experience with either Indigenous research methodologies or community participatory research methodologies. So I know that they understand to some degree the way that I think about my research questions, the way that I think it's important to communicate with my community, the goal, the intention of the research. And I think that part of why that came to my mind is Marguerite's question as a student in biomedical engineering. It's tough when you're a graduate student because sometimes you're at the mercy of your advisor, and so, or your committee or your lab boss. And so I think that's part of where, as much as possible, being strategic about, at least at the graduate student level, who you select as mentors. And maybe you do need to have somebody from an outside institution. Maybe you do need to end up changing out some of your committee members. And to me, it's unfortunate that sometimes those burdens of, it feels like those burdens of educating people about inclusivity and diversity fall on our shoulders, rather than people who don't know, taking some of the ownership of saying, all right, I know I have gaps in my knowledge, but I want to find out more. Because there's another question about TEK. Can you suggest how STEM educators can go about creating curriculum that includes TEK along with Western science in a community college setting? So there is existing curriculum that has been developed. One example that I would love to, I don't have a link with me, but if you look up Sifa Ramos, she has developed some curriculum, TEK curriculum, and I think, I can't remember if it was for the Forest Service. I think it was for the Forest Service. So one thing I would say is you don't have to necessarily create curriculum. There is curriculum that exists and I think can be modified. Oh, another example. So I mentioned Deanna, she's in the chat. One of the projects that we're going to be working on is sort of this indigenizing some of project, I think it's Project Wet, or is it Project Wild? Project Wild. So it's taking some existing curriculum and then incorporating Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous philosophies into existing curriculum. So I would say, first, see what's existing so that you don't, because curriculum development does take time, and see what's existing. And then from there, I don't know what my other recommendation would be.
It looks like someone did share that link in the chat that you were talking about too.
Okay, great. And then Jen, there's somebody who made a comment about being an auntie on campus. How do you connect with Native students on campus? Do you want to comment on that?
Oh, sure. Well, I work primarily with the Native students in the College of Forestry and Conservation, and I reach out to them every week, if not more. When pre-COVID, I would try to set up meetings. We would have lunches or gatherings in the Pain Garden, and get to know each other. Now we have the most Native students we've ever had. We have 10 Native graduate students right now in our program, and they are all really strong students, and they love to be mentors. And so we are working further with the undergraduates. A lot of them are in wildlife biology right now, but just to create those relationships that last, hoping to get some of these undergrads to move into graduate school as well. But then also there are networks across campus that, aunties and uncles all across campus, and we all are working with students, and we have various celebrations here in which we'll meet out on our oval and work together to kind of let students know what resources are available. And then we also have we have a new faculty here in wildlife biology, Erin Gomez, who has started a SACNAS student group here this semester, and that's been really amazing. And then we also have had ACES student groups here that have been really beneficial to attend conferences together and have those experiences engaging with the research that's happening across the country.
That's great. There's a lot of questions on here. Some really good questions too.
So one of the things, how do you utilize Indigenous faculty and staff groups on campus to support decolonized research? And I know one example is when, and Jen, you can comment on this. I think that part of it is having faculty and staff having the opportunity for professional development. So I know we've done different series at the University of Montana, just getting some of the basic information about these are the tribes in our state, all the way through to some things about Indigenous research methodologies. So there's kind of that full gamut of professional development that's available. And I know one of the things that we talk about is, as Jen and I and other scholars collaborate, is indigenizing research. So decolonizing research is kind of pulling something apart or taking away from, but when you're indigenizing, you're infusing, you're bringing in those Indigenous values, those Indigenous perspectives. So that's one of my comments about that one. Did you want to say anything about that, Jen?
I like the way you said that. I know in my my graduate work, I worked with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe, where this is their homeland here in Missoula, on a Superfund site and on a consultation, you know, with agencies. And when thinking about decolonizing, like taking it apart versus just bringing some different perspective, you know, diversifying the process and who's at the table was the most important part. And I think I like that.
There's a question that was kind of early on, asking advice on how a non-native person can mentor Native students to help foster their passion in science and help give them that sense of belonging. I think that's a very important question. And so would both of you be willing to address that?
Sure. So real quick, I'm going to recommend that Jen talks about the Cosmos project. So there is a NSF funded project that worked with or whoever the faculty advisor was, and they were, I think, maybe all non-Native faculty who were advising Native students. And so I think that would be a great example. Jen, if you could speak to that.
Sure. The Cosmos project was they brought us. I mean, I was a student at the time, and they brought us out onto the Salmon River with our advisors, and we met with Animi Poo or Nez Perce wildland managers as well as elders, and we really had a wonderful time just learning and being able to discuss in an open way our own experiences in science in different ways that we would like to be mentored. And then here at the University of Montana, we, out of the Cosmos project, developed our own Indigenous mentoring program that we've had 3 times so far with faculty. It's open to faculty, staff, and graduate students. And Dr. Oh, I blanked on her name. Oh, shoot. Anyway, she's helped facilitating the program, and it's been very successful. We've had more and more faculty and staff and graduate students attending it, and it's a small step, but we're going to continue it here at the University of Montana.
So one of the things that I think was, and this is my opinion as an observer, that was important from the Cosmos project was that the faculty, she mentioned the faculty went to the communities. So the faculty, I think, had to, and here in the questions, you know, you had to be willing to and wanting to engage with and understand your students' needs. And I would say one other thing is thinking about mentorship as a two-way path. You're not just mentoring your student and teaching your student and inspiring your student, but allowing your student to share back, allowing your student to say, this is my community, this is how my people approach this. So being open to those ideas of engagement and mentorship with students.
I just have a quick question of my own. I know that, you know, this past year has been a very challenging time for our Native students, especially in our communities that have been the hardest hit. And so as an institution, as an organization, we reflect back on that, and looking at, taking pieces from the article and some things that you shared, what are some other things that we need to be aware of right now to kind of help and ensure that our students, these students, our Native Indigenous students, are feeling, that inclusivity, because it's been hard, right? It's been difficult. I mean, we've had to move from in-person, to remote online, and just that, access to different things, has been challenging. But what are some things, and I'm sure that both of you have thought about this and thought this through, especially in working with your students at your institutions, but what are some things that we can be doing now for our Native students to keep them engaged, for sure?
Did you want to comment, Jen?
Well, I guess just the experience that I've had this last year, keeping them engaged. I mean, it's constant check-in. I'm, to make sure, hey, how are you doing? And very individual. I call them and I make or I write to them individually, making sure they know all of the resources available, and also all of the things that we're all going through, that they're not alone. If you're fatigued because you're on the computer for 10 hours a day, we understand. Here's some things you can do to break that up. Or if checking in earlier in the semester to see if there's issues with classes. Do you need a tutor? We can get you a tutor. Do you need, that's made a lot of difference. But then also on my part, understanding when they've just had enough and they need a break. But being there to let them know that I'm here when you're ready to come back.
Yeah, I would say it's been a challenge to keep students engaged because we've been social distancing. So before, where we would be able to bring our students in, kind of be the auntie and say, all right, I'm cooking lunch, come over to the cultural center, and students could come and gather and eat and just talk. We can't do that now. And so how do you keep that kind of sense of community so that they have those supports of talking to each other, of sharing food? And one of the things that we've done that I love, and especially I mentioned before, my colleague Linda has been really good about doing live streams or doing Zoom, teaching traditional things over Zoom, whether it's traditional craft work or traditional food preparation. And it's more just to keep people connected, because you're in your house and people are in their house, and you might maybe see them at the grocery store, but you're most likely not going to see them on campus. And so I think that's been one of the hardest parts of this past year, is that disconnection. And so utilizing technology, like Jen said, staying connected, checking in on each other. And I think that's one of the things we see at my tribal college, is making sure we are paying attention to our students' mental health. We can check, all right, do you have a laptop? Great. Do you have internet? Well, it's kind of sketchy, but yeah, we've got enough internet. Do you have your books? Do you have food? But then, so those are kind of like the basic things. But what about, how do we address those issues of, do you feel like, she mentioned, you've been on the computer for 10 hours. Are you starting to burn out? Do you need a break? Do we need to adjust some timelines? Do we need to have somebody that you can visit with? Because a lot of this has been, even for those of us who are not students, hard to manage, because being, whether it's a student or a professional, plus a parent, plus a community person, and everything that's going on around us and in our homes, it's been just unanticipated. How can you prepare for something like that? So.
Well, to our attendees, we have a few more, several more minutes. I want to encourage, if anyone has any questions right now, please feel free to post them in the chat. We can take a few more questions. before we start wrapping up the webinar. And it looks like, let's see. Oh, here's the question that came up. What are some things you'd like to see professional societies do to make STEM a more inclusive space?
Well, I loved what you said at the beginning, Daryl. The idea that an organization at all levels has diverse representation. And I think I'd love to see that at colleges, universities, and organizations. And, you know, to me, that is one way. It like gives me goosebumps to think about that level of representation. If you say you're about it, then do it, you know, not just be talk. And I think that's one example of increasing the inclusivity. If you have that true representation at all levels of your organization, you're more likely to have a diverse array of voices at the table, the decision-making tables, where that can inform your protocols, your policies related to diversity and inclusivity.
You know, I guess I would ask back though, what, you know, as the push of this last year for diversity, inclusion, equity, and inclusion has been built up, I guess I'm just still seeing white men leading the group. And what do we do? You know, how do we continue on? And that's been said before by students, you know, if we don't quite have the voice we want, how do we keep going?
Well, I almost printed out, is it Bunky Echo Hawk? And he did a cartoon or a drawing of bring your own chairs. You know, they don't invite you to the table. So then it shows these two ladies carrying their lawn chairs. And to echo or to reflect on what Jen said, you know, sometimes we're not invited to those opportunities. And I noticed somebody talked about we're not represented in the data. So the book, you know, Beyond the Asterisk, how do we do that? And one thing that I loved about the last SACNAS conference I went to was there were two other scholars, African American scholars, and they talked about how to amplify each other's voices. And so, and I know this isn't a super great connection to the question, but something that I think is really relevant is how do we push each other forward, whether it's people of color or whether it's Native people, but cite each other's manuscript, or, you know, each other's articles, echo each other. You know, there's ways that we can push our data, that we can push our research agendas. So just thinking about, sometimes you're not invited to the table, so bring your own chair, and what does that look like?
And that just made me think of something real quickly, is that, you know, even when we are invited to these spaces, you know, we show up and we're there to represent and to voice, you know, our comments. And at the beginning, but, you know, this is a honeymoon period, like, yeah, great, you know, we're glad that you're here, we have this representation. But then the more that you're starting to make the organization, the committee aware, then, you know, then it's, you know, okay, well, we weren't ready for this, right? You're making them uncomfortable. You're making them kind of have to think about some things. And the unfortunate part is a lot of times that we find our representation kind of, you know, leaving because they really weren't welcomed, you know, their thoughts, their opinions, their views, you know, this different, you know, point of view. So it's really important that we, you know, support each other as much as we can to in taking on, and especially those that are in leadership roles or stepping into those roles. I mean, it's so important that we share that. Yeah, this chat, I'm sorry, I've just been distracted too a little because there's so many things are being shared in the chat. And for sure, I will copy and paste and we will make this available as we send out the information about the recording of this webinar too. So thank you everyone for sharing your information, the links, just everything that's here. So many great resources. So this is really great. This is good. We have time for maybe one more question. So does anyone else want to share, have a question for our wonderful panelist?
Well, one thing I just want to respond real quickly to, there's a question about evaluators or evaluation resources. So the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, AHEC, does have an Indigenous research or Indigenous evaluation framework. So if that's something you're interested in, I would recommend checking that out as an example. Also, there are, I think it's Kaufman and Associates, are available to do evaluation, and they have used Indigenous evaluation frameworks. So just a quick comment there, and then if there's another question that we want to respond to before we end.
All right. Well, I guess we can go ahead and wrap up here. Oh wait, we have one more. We have one question. Let's see. Question about supporting Native students, staff, and faculty. They're asked to do so many things outside of their job description, grad student progress. How do we better support our Native students, staff, and faculty?
I don't know. That's a tough question. I don't know, Jen, if you want to respond to this, but I just think back, part of it is this is where we need our non-native counterparts to step it up. Yeah, it does fall on our shoulders. There is that cultural taxation that we end up bearing the burden of. So I don't know what else to say beyond we need those, I don't know if you'd say allies or our counterparts, to step up their game and do their part in learning and not expect us to either do the teaching or be the voice. But that's my comment. And Jen, if you want to comment on that too.
Well, I know that on our campus, there's a bit of a support group of Native faculty and staff that do get together. Willow, I think, has been an instrumental part of faculty being able to kind of share their experiences and problem solve some of those heavy asks on them constantly. And I know students come to me often and say that if they're the only Native student in the class, they get asked to give an explanation, a history, or a background of something, and it's exhausting. And they try to convey to the instructor that they can't represent all Native Americans, and they're just themselves, and it becomes. But we have some great articulate graduate students that I think are able to share, set some limits, and they are supported by our program to do that. I was wondering if I could answer one question that was up further, or just talk about it. Allison Martin was talking about Western science used to weaponize and indigenous communities, and she brought up the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea, and I do think that it's important to challenge. I mean, even if it's not successful, there's a conflict, in epistemologies of those junctions, and if I mean, at the very least, I think that consultation should be more rigorous in those situations, and equal. There should be equal voices, particularly for indigenous communities being threatened by science.
Yeah, and then I put in the chat, one of the, as we think about data, We are going to be next week launching a work climate survey where we're going to be looking at the experiences of Native American faculty in STEM. So if anybody on the webinar wants to participate in that, there's my email address, and I'd be happy to share the link next week if you want to contribute to the data.
That's great. All right, well, we will go ahead and wrap up here. I want to thank our guests again, Jennifer and Ruth, for taking time out of their schedules to be with us today. Very much appreciated. This was a really great information sharing, and again, the chat full of resources. Thank you all who contributed to that as well. But before we go, I have a couple of things I just needed to share with our audience. Immediately following this webinar, you will receive a brief survey. We encourage you to complete it to provide feedback and to help us hear from you. And also, if there's other interest topics, that you're wanting to hear, we're more than happy to try to get those coordinated as well. And to continue this discussion, if you go to the membership portal, if you're a SACNAS member, go to the membership portal. We do have online communities, and we do have one set up specifically for our Native American Indigenous community. We definitely can continue this chat, share more resources there as well. And so finally, if you enjoyed today's webinar, you can find upcoming and previous webinars at our website at sacnas.org/webinars. And also, we also have a SACNAS YouTube channel. We have some really good content there. And I really encourage you, if you haven't already, to go and check it out and see what we have available for you to share as well. And so again, this concludes our webinar for today. Thank you both again for joining us, and we hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.